The Wyoming wind howled across Devil's Ridge like the breath of angry spirits, rattling the wooden shutters of Eleanor Whitmore's cabin with relentless fury. September of 1876 had brought an early winter to the Medicine Bow Mountains, and the first snow had already dusted the highest peaks visible from her kitchen window. Eleanor paused in her morning chores, watching ice crystals form on the glass while her coffee grew cold in its tin cup. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years had passed since tuberculosis claimed her husband Samuel, leaving her alone on 160 acres of government land that seemed determined to reject every attempt at cultivation. The soil proved rocky and unforgiving, the growing season brutally short, and the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down a treacherous mountain trail. Most widows would have sold out and returned to civilization, but Eleanor possessed the kind of stubborn determination that had driven her family westward from Pennsylvania in the first place. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter and stepped onto the covered porch, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read 28 degrees, unseasonably cold for mid-September. Her small herd of cattle huddled in the lee of the barn, their coats already thickening for winter. The chickens refused to venture from their coop, leaving Eleanor to wonder if she'd have enough feed to sustain them through what promised to be a harsh season. The sound of her axe-splitting kindling echoed across the valley as she worked to replenish the woodpile. Each swing sent shockwaves through her shoulders, reminding her of muscles grown strong from necessity rather than choice. Samuel had been the one with the broad back and powerful arms, while Eleanor handled the cooking, sewing, and garden work. Death had transformed her into both husband and wife, forcing capabilities she'd never imagined possessing. As she worked, movement caught her eye along the tree line. A lone figure emerged from the pine forest, moving with the cautious gait of someone injured or exhausted. Eleanor's hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Living alone this far from civilization meant preparing for any possibility, from desperate drifters to wounded animals seeking shelter. The figure drew closer, revealing itself to be a young person wrapped in what appeared to be a torn blanket. Eleanor's maternal instincts warred with frontier caution as she watched the stranger stumble and nearly fall before catching himself against a fence post. Something about the way he moved suggested youth rather than threat, vulnerability rather than menace. "Hello there," she called out, keeping her voice steady while maintaining distance. "Are you hurt?" The figure looked up, and Eleanor gasped. A boy, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, with the distinctive features and long black hair of the Lakota people. His dark eyes held a mixture of pain and wariness as he studied her across the 30 yards that separated them. Blood-stained, the makeshift blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and his left leg appeared to bear no weight. Eleanor's mind raced through the implications. The Lakota had been at war with the United States for months, ever since gold prospectors invaded the Black Hills in violation of treaty agreements. Just 3 months earlier, news had reached even their isolated valley of Lieutenant Colonel Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn. The entire territory remained on edge, with military patrols and hostile war parties creating an atmosphere of constant tension. Yet this was clearly just a child, wounded and alone, far from any war party or village. Eleanor found herself caught between frontier wisdom that counseled caution around any indigenous person and the basic human decency that refused to abandon an injured child to the elements. "I won't hurt you," she said softly, taking a careful step forward. "You're bleeding." The boy's eyes narrowed, and he spoke a few words in what Eleanor assumed was Lakota. His tone suggested a question, though she couldn't interpret the meaning. When she shook her head apologetically, he switched to heavily accented English. "You, white woman, Alone? The question carried layers of meaning. Was she asking if he posed a threat, whether others might arrive to help him, if she had protection against potential retaliation? Eleanor chose honesty over strategy. Yes, I live alone. My husband died 3 years ago. She gestured toward the cabin. This is my home. The boy's gaze moved from her face to the rifle in her hands, then to the solid structure of the cabin behind her. Eleanor could almost see him calculating distances, exits, and possibilities. Despite his youth and injuries, he possessed the situational awareness of someone raised in a dangerous world. "What happened to you?" Eleanor asked, noting how he favored his left side. "Those wounds look fresh." The boy's face darkened, and he spoke a single word with unmistakable venom. "Cougar." Eleanor's blood chilled. Mountain lions had been more active this season, driven to lower elevations by early snow in the high country. Just last week, she'd found tracks around her chicken coop and had taken to bringing the animals into the barn each night. A cougar. Her tack would explain the boy's injuries and his presence so far from any settlement. Where did this happen? She pressed gently. The boy pointed toward the high ridges to the north, where ancient pine forests gave way to alpine meadows. Eleanor knew that country, had hunted deer there with Samuel during their early years on the homestead. It was rough, terrain, full of rocky overhangs and hidden ravines where a large cat might easily corner its prey. "How long ago?" The boy held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the sun's position overhead. 3 hours, perhaps, though his journey down from the high country would have taken considerable time with those injuries. Eleanor noticed he kept glancing nervously at the tree line, as if expecting pursuit. "Are others looking for you?" she asked. The boy's hesitation spoke volumes. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Hunt party. 5 sons passed." He struggled with the English words. "I follow the elk trail. Get lost. Cat find me instead." 5 days lost in the wilderness explained his gaunt appearance and the desperation in his eyes. Eleanor realized she faced a decision that would echo far beyond this single moment. She could offer basic aid and send him on his way, minimizing her risk while fulfilling minimal humanitarian obligations. She could alert the military authorities at Fort Steele, 40 miles south, and let them handle what was technically a matter of Indian relations. Or she could do what every decent person should do when faced with a wounded child: provide shelter, medical care, and protection until he could safely return to his people. The choice seemed obvious until Eleanor considered the broader implications. The Lakota were considered hostile by territorial authorities. Harboring one, even a child, could be construed as providing aid to enemy combatants. If military patrols discovered the boy on her property, she could face charges of treason or collaboration with hostile forces. Worse, if the boy's hunting party came looking for him and found him in her care, would they view her as protector or captor? Eleanor had heard conflicting stories about Lakota treatment of white settlers. Some spoke of noble warriors who honored courage and showed mercy to those who earned their respect. Others described savage raiders who showed no distinction between combatants and civilians. The boy swayed on his feet, exhaustion overcoming his attempts to remain alert. Eleanor watched him struggle to stay upright and realized the philosophical debate was academic. She could not in good conscience allow a child to collapse from blood loss and exposure while she debated political ramifications. "Come inside," she said firmly, setting the rifle aside and moving toward him. "Let me look at those wounds." The boy's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting such an offer. He took a halting step backward, suspicion warring with desperate need in his expression. "I'm a nurse," Eleanor explained, though the term was perhaps too generous. She'd learned basic medical skills from necessity, treating everything from Samuel's pneumonia to her own broken wrist after a fall from the barn roof. "I can help you heal." Still, the boy hesitated, caught between the ingrained wariness of his people toward whites and the obvious sincerity in Eleanor's voice. Eleanor recognized the internal struggle, remembering her own first encounters with the indigenous peoples of this territory. Fear and mistrust flowed both directions, fueled by decades of broken promises, cultural misunderstandings, and escalating violence. "What's your name?" she asked, hoping to bridge the gap with basic human connection. The boy studied her face for a long moment before answering, "Lakota." The name rolled off his tongue with musical cadence, quite different from the harsh consonants of English. "Lakota," Eleanor repeated, trying to approximate his pronunciation. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore." She gestured toward herself, then toward the cabin. "Will you let me help you, Lakota?" The use of his name seemed to break through some barrier. Dakota's shoulders sagged slightly, and Eleanor realized how much effort he'd been expending just to remain standing. The adrenaline that had carried him down from the high country was finally fading, leaving behind a frightened, injured child in desperate need of care. "Mountain cats still hunt," he said quietly, glancing again toward the forest. "Follow the blood trail." Eleanor's spine stiffened as the implication sank in. The cougar that had attacked Lakota might well be tracking him, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of easy prey. Mountain lions were persistent hunters, capable of following a trail for miles if sufficiently motivated. A wounded animal would represent an ideal target. "Then we need to get you inside quickly," Eleanor said, abandoning caution and moving to support Dakota's injured side. "And we need to clean those wounds before infection sets in." Dakota allowed her assistance, though Eleanor could feel the tension in his muscles, ready to flee at the first sign of treachery. Together, they made their way toward the cabin, Eleanor's mind already cataloguing the medical supplies she had available and the defensive preparations she might need to make. As they reached the porch steps, a sound from the forest made them both freeze. A low, rumbling call echoed across the valley, neither fully roar nor growl, but something in between. Dakota's face went pale beneath his copper skin, and his grip tightened on Eleanor's arm. "Cougar," he whispered unnecessarily. Eleanor helped him up the steps as quickly as his injuries allowed, her own heart racing as she realized the gravity of their situation. Not only was she harboring a Lakota boy in direct violation of territorial policy, but she was also potentially facing a mountain lion attack with limited ammunition and no backup. As she closed and barred the cabin door behind them, Eleanor wondered if her instinct for mercy had just condemned them both to a very dangerous night. The boy slumped into Samuel's old chair by the fireplace, finally allowing exhaustion to claim him, while Eleanor checked the loads in her rifle and tried to remember everything Samuel had taught her about defending against large predators. Outside, the wind continued to howl across Devil's Ridge, but now it carried with it something else, the promise of a test that would challenge everything Eleanor thought she knew about courage, compassion, and the true meaning of civilization in the wilderness. The die was cast. There could be no turning back from the choice she'd made. Whatever consequences followed would have to be faced with the same determination that had kept her alive and independent on this unforgiving frontier. Dakota's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, but Eleanor remained alert, watching the windows and listening for sounds that didn't belong to the natural symphony of the mountain night. She had chosen mercy over safety, humanity over policy. Now she would discover whether that choice would prove to be wisdom or folly. Dawn brought no relief to Eleanor's vigil. She had dozed fitfully in Samuel's old rocking chair, rifle across. Her lap, starting awake at every creak of settling timber or gust of wind against the shutters. Dakota had slept deeply, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion after the ordeal of his escape from the high country. In the pale morning light, filtering through gaps in the wooden shutters, Eleanor could properly assess the extent of his injuries. 3 parallel gashes raked across his left shoulder, deep enough to expose muscle beneath torn flesh. The wounds had clotted during the night, but infection remained a serious threat. His left thigh bore puncture marks where the mountain lion's claws had found purchase, and a long scratch along his ribs suggested the attack had been prolonged rather than a single pounce. Most concerning was a bump on his skull, partially hidden by his long black hair, indicating he'd struck his head during the encounter. Eleanor heated water over the fire and gathered her medical supplies: whiskey for cleaning, needle and thread, clean cotton cloth torn from one of Samuel's old shirts, and a jar of honey that served as an antiseptic. The boy stirred as she approached with steaming water and fresh bandages. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cougar? Dakota asked immediately, his dark eyes alert despite his obvious pain. No sign since last night, Eleanor replied, though she'd heard something moving around the chicken coop just before dawn. But we need to clean these wounds properly before infection sets in. Dakota nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of infection in the wilderness. Eleanor began with the shoulder wounds, cleaning away dried blood and debris. The boy's stoicism impressed her. He gripped the chair arms tightly, but made no sound as she poured whiskey over the torn flesh. "You're brave," she commented, beginning to stitch the deepest gash. "How old are you, Dakota?" 14 winters, he replied in his careful English. "Old enough to hunt with men, young enough to get lost following elk." Eleanor detected a note of shame in his voice. "Getting lost happens to experienced hunters too. The mountains can confuse anyone." As she worked, Dakota began sharing details of his ordeal. He'd been with a hunting party led by his uncle, tracking a large elk herd toward winter feeding grounds. Eager to prove himself, he'd followed a promising trail into unfamiliar territory, becoming separated from the group when fog rolled in from the higher elevations. 3 days I walk in circles, he explained, wincing as Eleanor cleaned the thigh. Wounds. Find creek, follow the wrong direction. When fog lift, mountains look strange, not home mountains. The cougar had found him drinking from a mountain stream, approaching silently through dense underbrush. Only his horse's warning whinny had given Dakota enough time to dive behind a fallen log before the big cat launched its attack. The horse hadn't been so fortunate. "Spirit horse," Dakota said quietly when Eleanor asked about his mount. "Gift from grandfather. Cougar kill him instead of me." Eleanor heard the grief in his voice and understood that losing the horse represented more than transportation. Among the Lakota, horses were family members, companions, and sources of spiritual power. The boy had survived, but at a cost that went beyond physical wounds. "The cougar attacked you both." "I have a knife." Dakota touched a beaded sheath at his belt. "Cut the cat on the face, make it angry but hurt. It kill horse first, then come for me. I climb a tree, but the cat wait underneath. Finally it goes away to eat horse." The story explained how Dakota had escaped, but also why the mountain lion might still be tracking him. Cats that developed a taste for easy prey often became persistent hunters, especially if wounded and angry. Eleanor finished bandaging his injuries as the morning progressed, noting how quickly Dakota's natural vitality was returning with proper care and rest. The boy accepted her ministrations with a mixture of gratitude and continued wariness, clearly still uncertain about her motivations. "Why are you help me?" he asked bluntly as Eleanor prepared breakfast. "White soldiers hunt my people. You could get a reward for capturing a Lakota warrior." "You're not a warrior," Eleanor replied, stirring oatmeal over the fire. "You're a boy who got hurt and needed help. That's reason enough." Dakota considered this while accepting the bowl of hot cereal sweetened with honey. "My people have stories about white medicine women," Say some have good spirits, see past skin color to the person underneath. The observation surprised Eleanor. She'd never thought of herself as a medicine woman, simply someone who'd learned practical skills from necessity. But she recognized the respect in Dakota's voice and realized that her actions carried significance beyond her own cultural understanding. Their conversation was interrupted by sounds from outside, the lowing of cattle in distress and the sharp bark of Eleanor's dog Rex from somewhere near the barn. Eleanor grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, peering through gaps between shutters. What she saw made her blood run cold. 3 horsemen had emerged from the tree line, moving purposefully toward her homestead. Even at distance, their military bearing was unmistakable. Cavalry soldiers, probably from Fort Steele. Rex circled them at a safe distance, hackles raised and tail low, sensing threat in their approach. "Soldiers," Eleanor whispered urgently to Dakota. "3 of them, coming this way." The boy's face went pale, but he struggled to rise from the chair. "I must run. If they find me here, you will be punished." "You can barely walk," Eleanor protested, but she was already thinking through options. The root cellar beneath the kitchen offered limited concealment, but searching soldiers would likely find it. The barn was too obvious, and the open terrain offered no escape route for someone in Dakota's condition. The attic, she decided quickly. There's a crawl space under the eaves where Samuel stored extra supplies. "Can you climb a ladder?" Dakota nodded grimly, though sweat beaded his forehead from the effort of standing. Eleanor helped him up the narrow ladder to the cabin's loft, then into the cramped space beneath the slanted roof. She handed him a water jug and some bread, whispering instructions to remain absolutely silent, no matter what he heard below. By the time the soldiers reached her door, Eleanor had composed herself and was calmly tending the fire as if this were any ordinary morning. The knock came firm and authoritative, the sound of men accustomed to having doors opened without question. "Mrs. Whitmore." The voice carried the crisp accent of an educated Easterner. "Sergeant William Harrison, 2nd. Cavalry. We'd like a word, ma'am." Eleanor opened the door to find 3 soldiers in blue uniforms, their horses steaming in the cold morning air. Sergeant Harrison was a lean man in his 30s, with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes that missed little. His companions looked younger, nervous recruits who kept scanning the horizon as if expecting attack. "Sergeant," Eleanor replied evenly, "what brings the cavalry this far up Devil's Ridge?" "We're tracking hostiles, ma'am. Had reports of Lakota war parties in this vicinity." Harrison's gaze moved past her, taking in the cabin's interior. "Mind if we come in? It's been a cold ride up from the fort." Eleanor stepped aside, having little choice but to appear cooperative. "Of course, I'll put coffee on." As the soldiers entered, Eleanor noticed their eyes cataloguing everything: the layout of rooms, potential hiding places, signs of recent occupancy. One of the younger men, introduced as Private Coleman, lingered near the ladder to the loft. "Seen any Indians in these parts lately?" Harrison asked, settling into the chair Dakota had vacated an hour earlier. "We've got reliable intelligence about a hunting party moving through this area." "Can't say I have," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Though I did find some tracks around my chicken coop yesterday. Could have been Indian. Ponies, could have been wild horses. It wasn't technically a lie, though the tracks had actually been from Rex chasing a raccoon." Eleanor poured coffee for the soldiers, while her mind raced through potential complications. Had they found signs of Dakota's passage? Were they following a specific trail or conducting a general sweep? "Any tracks this morning?" Pressed the 3rd soldier, Corporal Davis, a burly man with suspicious eyes. "Haven't been outside yet to check," Eleanor answered. "Been tending my fire since dawn." Harrison sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Understand you lost your husband a few years back. Must be difficult, managing a homestead alone this far from civilization. The comment seemed casual, but Eleanor sensed underlying implications. Was he expressing genuine sympathy or subtly questioning why a lone woman would remain in such an isolated location, perhaps suggesting she might be susceptible to offers of protection in exchange for information? "I manage well enough," she replied curtly. "I'm sure you do. Takes a strong woman to survive out here." Harrison stood and moved to the window, studying the view toward the forest. "Thing is, Mrs. Whitmore, these particular Indians we're tracking aren't just hunting game. Intelligence suggests they're scouting for weaknesses in our patrol routes, looking for isolated settlements that might be vulnerable to attack." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. If the soldiers believed Lakota was part of a war party rather than a lost hunting party, the stakes had just increased dramatically. Discovery wouldn't just mean trouble for her, it could cost the boy his life. "You think I'm in danger?" she asked, injecting appropriate concern into her voice. "Could be. That's why we're checking on folks like yourself, making sure everyone's alert to potential threats." Harrison turned back to face her. "You keep any weapons handy?" Eleanor gestured toward the rifle mounted above the door. "Samuel's Winchester. I can shoot straight enough to hit what I aim at." "Good. You'll want to keep it loaded and close at hand." Harrison paused, studying her face. "Thing is, these Indians are clever. Sometimes they'll send a wounded decoy ahead, someone who looks harmless, to scout defenses or gain access to a homestead." The sergeant's words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Had they found evidence of Lakota's presence? Blood on the ground, disturbed vegetation, something that indicated an injured person had sought shelter here. She forced herself to maintain eye contact while her heart hammered against her. "Ribs, a decoy," she managed. "Young brave, maybe pretending to be hurt or lost. Plays on Christian sympathy while gathering information for a larger attack." Harrison's voice remained conversational, but his eyes had hardened. "You'd tell us if anyone like that had approached your property, wouldn't you, Mrs. Whitmore?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying the acrid smell of danger. Eleanor realized she was balancing on a knife's edge, with Lakota's life and her own freedom hanging in the balance. "Of course I would," she replied, meeting Harrison's stare directly. "I may live alone, but I'm not foolish enough to harbor enemies." The sergeant nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with her response. But Eleanor noticed Private Coleman had moved to the base of the loft ladder and was studying the floor carefully. Her breath caught as she saw what had captured his attention: a small smear of blood where Lakota had briefly rested before climbing to the attic. "Sergeant," Coleman called quietly, "might want to look at this." Harrison joined his subordinate, crouching to examine the dark stain on the wooden planks. Eleanor's mind raced through possible explanations. A cut finger while preparing breakfast, blood from the beef she'd cooked 2 days earlier. The soldiers' expression suggested they weren't buying innocent explanations. "That's fresh," Coleman observed. "Still tacky to the touch." Eleanor felt sweat forming despite the cabin's chill. Above them, she prayed silently that Lakota had the wisdom to remain perfectly still no matter what transpired below. "Mrs. Whitmore." Harrison rose slowly, his hand resting casually on his service revolver. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Has anyone else been in this cabin recently?" The moment crystallized around Eleanor like ice forming on a winter pond. She could confess, throw herself on their mercy, and hope military justice would recognize the humanitarian nature of her actions. She could lie outright and hope they'd accept her denial. Or she could find a middle path that might protect both, herself and Lakota. "I cut myself yesterday while cleaning fish," she said steadily. "Knife slipped and opened a gash in my hand." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Show me." Eleanor extended her hands, palms up, revealing the calluses and small scars that came from frontier life but no fresh wounds. The sergeant's expression hardened. "Try again, ma'am." Before Eleanor could respond, sounds erupted from outside, Rex barking frantically, followed by the terrified lowing of cattle and the distinctive scream of horses in mortal terror. All four people in the cabin turned toward the windows as an otherworldly roar echoed across the valley. "Mountain lion!" Corporal Davis breathed, his face pale. Through the window, Eleanor could see her cattle stampeding toward the barn, while Rex circled protectively, snapping at something in the shadows near the tree line. The soldiers' horses reared and pulled against their reins, eyes rolling white with fear. "Big one by the sound of it," Harrison muttered, momentarily distracted from his interrogation. "Coleman, secure the horses before they bolt. Davis, check your rifle." As the soldiers responded to the immediate threat, Eleanor caught a glimpse of movement in the forest. A massive, tawny shape moved through the underbrush with liquid grace, easily twice the size of any mountain lion she'd ever seen. The beast paused at the forest edge, yellow eyes fixed on the cabin with unmistakable intelligence. The cougar that had attacked Dakota had indeed followed the blood trail, but this was no ordinary predator. This was an ancient killer, scarred and cunning, that had learned to associate human scent with easy prey, and it was hunting. "Jesus Christ," Coleman whispered from the doorway. "Look at the size of that thing." The mountain lion stepped into full view, its massive shoulders rippling beneath tawny fur marked with old scars. One ear had been torn in some long-ago battle, and fresh scratches across its muzzle testified to its recent encounter with Dakotas. Knife, the beast studied the humans with the calculating gaze of an apex predator, evaluating potential threats and opportunities. "Nobody move sudden," Harrison commanded quietly. "Mountain lions don't usually attack unless cornered or protecting. Cubs." But even as he spoke, the great cat began moving toward the cabin with purposeful strides. This wasn't defensive behavior. This was a hunting approach. The cougar had followed Dakota's scent trail and associated it with this location. In its primitive mind, wounded prey waited somewhere nearby. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she realized the full implications. The mountain lion wasn't just stalking randomly, it was specifically hunting Dakota. And if the soldiers discovered why the predator had come here, both she and the boy would face consequences far worse than military interrogation. The great cat was now 50 yards from the cabin and closing steadily, its yellow eyes never wavering, from the structure where its quarry had taken refuge. Behind its scarred features lay an intelligence shaped by years of successful kills and the bitter memory of fresh wounds that demanded vengeance. Eleanor gripped her rifle tighter, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just their immediate survival, but whether her act of mercy would be discovered in the worst possible way. The stakes had escalated beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd first offered shelter to an injured boy. Outside, the mountain lion gathered itself for what would surely be its final approach, drawn by instincts older than human civilization, and deadlier than any army. The mountain lion's roar shattered the morning stillness like thunder-splitting stone. Eleanor watched through the cabin window as the massive predator began its deliberate approach, each stride bringing it closer to a confrontation that would expose everything she'd risked to protect. Sergeant Harrison barked orders to his men, while the beast's yellow eyes remained fixed on the cabin with unnerving intelligence. "Coleman, get those horses secured before they break loose," Harrison commanded, his service revolver already drawn. "Davis, position yourself at the east window. Mrs. Whitmore, stay clear of the doorway." But Eleanor barely heard the instructions. Her attention was riveted on the cougar's behavior, which defied everything she knew about mountain lion hunting. And patterns. This wasn't territorial defense or opportunistic predation. The great cat moved with specific purpose, following a scent trail that led directly to her cabin. More terrifying still was the fresh blood matting the fur around its muzzle. and the deliberate way it tested the air, seeking something particular among the complex mix of human and animal odors. "That's not normal hunting behavior," she said quietly, more to herself than the soldiers. Harrison glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's mind raced. How could she explain the cougar's targeted approach without revealing Dakota's presence? Mountain lions usually avoid human settlements. This one seems determined, probably rabid, Davis muttered from his position at the window. Would explain the aggression, but Eleanor could see the cat's movements were too coordinated, too purposeful for rabies. This was a skilled predator pursuing specific prey, and that prey was hidden in her attic. Every step the cougar took toward the cabin increased the likelihood that the soldiers would piece together the truth. From above came the faintest creak of floorboards. Eleanor's heart stopped as she realized Dakota was moving, perhaps trying to get a better view of the approaching danger. One of the soldiers would surely notice any sound from the loft, especially Harrison, whose suspicious eyes already suggested he doubted her story about the blood on the floor. "What was that?" Coleman asked, tilting his head toward the ceiling. "Old. A cabin settles in the cold," Eleanor replied quickly, though sweat beaded her forehead despite the morning chill. "Been doing it for years." The mountain lion had closed to 30 yards and showed no signs of slowing. If anything, its pace had quickened as the scent trail grew stronger. Eleanor realized with growing horror that the beast intended to enter. The cabin, drawn by the unmistakable smell of its wounded quarry, hiding above. "It's coming straight for the door," Davis observed, raising his rifle. "Never seen anything like it." Harrison moved to Eleanor's side, studying the approaching predator with professional assessment. "How long has this cat been in the area?" "I've only seen tracks for the past week," Eleanor answered truthfully, "but nothing this bold before." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "Tracks around your property specifically, or just the general area?" Eleanor felt the trap closing around her. Every honest answer drew Harrison closer to questions she couldn't safely address. "Around the property. That's why I've been keeping the livestock closer to the barn. Yet you didn't think to mention this when we asked about Indian sign? Mountain lions and war parties often travel the same routes." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the cougar reached the cabin's porch. The massive animal paused at the steps, its scarred head weaving back and forth as it tested scent patterns with scientific precision. Eleanor's breath caught as she watched the predator's nostrils flare, focusing on something that had passed this way recently. "Jesus," Coleman whispered, "look at the size of those paws." The mountain lion placed one enormous front paw on the bottom step, wood creaking under its weight. Eleanor estimated the beast at over 200 pounds, a giant even by Rocky Mountain standards. Scars crisscrossed its tawny hide, testament to decades of violent encounters. This was an apex predator in its prime, experienced enough to have survived countless challenges and intelligent enough to adapt its hunting strategies. Another creak from the ceiling made all 4 humans freeze. This time the sound was unmistakably deliberate movement, not thermal expansion of old wood. Harrison's head snapped upward, his hand tightening on his revolver grip. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, never taking his eyes off the ceiling, "I think we need to check your attic." Eleanor's world collapsed around her like a house of cards in a windstorm. Discovery was seconds away, and with it would come consequences. She couldn't bear to contemplate. Military justice for harboring enemy combatants could mean imprisonment or worse. For Dakota, capture by hostile soldiers might mean summary execution. But before anyone could move toward the ladder, the mountain lion made its decision. With liquid grace that belied its massive size, the predator bounded up the porch steps and hurled itself against the cabin door. The thick pine planks, seasoned by years of Wyoming weather, held against the initial impact. But the force sent shock waves through the entire structure, rattling windows and making dust rain from the ceiling. Eleanor heard timber groaning under stress as the cougar regrouped for another assault. "That door won't hold long," Harrison stated grimly. "Coleman, help me barricade it. Davis, keep that rifle ready." As the soldiers moved to reinforce the entrance, another tremendous impact shook the cabin. This time, Eleanor heard the distinctive sound of wood beginning to splinter. The mountain lion wasn't just trying to force entry, it was systematically destroying the barrier between itself and its target. "Why won't it give up?" Davis asked, sweat beading his forehead despite the cold. "Animals that big don't usually persist against human structures." Eleanor knew the answer but couldn't voice it. The cougar's behavior made perfect sense if it was tracking specific prey. Dakota's scent filled the cabin, leading the predator to believe its quarry was trapped and vulnerable. The beast would continue its assault until it either succeeded in entering or was driven away by superior force. A third impact sent cracked spider webbing across the door's surface. Through the gaps, Eleanor glimpsed yellow eyes burning with predatory focus. The mountain lion's breathing came in harsh pants as it prepared for another assault, muscles bunching under scarred hide. "We need to drive it off," Harrison decided. "Mrs. Whitmore, is there a back exit?" "Just the root cellar entrance on the north side," Eleanor replied. "But it's narrow and leads underground. Better than nothing. Coleman, check if that route's clear." The sergeant positioned himself at the main window, rifle raised. "If this thing gets inside, we'll have a fight in close quarters." As if responding to his words, the mountain lion launched itself against the door with renewed fury. This assault produced an ominous crack as one of the support boards gave way. Eleanor could see tawny fur through the widening gap, and worse, she could see the predator's nostrils working as it caught stronger traces of its quarry's scent. From the attic came another sound, this time unmistakably human, a sharp intake of breath as Dakota reacted to the increasing violence below. Eleanor's eyes met Harrison's, and she saw in his expression the moment when suspicion crystallized into certainty. "There's someone up there," the sergeant said quietly. "Someone you've been hiding." Eleanor opened her mouth to deny it, but another thunderous impact against the door made further deception pointless. The mountain lion's assault had reached frenzied intensity, driven by the proximity of its wounded prey. No amount of explanation could account for such targeted aggression, except the presence of the exact person Harrison suspected was hiding above. "Sergeant!" Davis called urgently from the window. "We've got bigger problems. Look toward the tree line." Eleanor followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. Emerging from the forest came riders, at least 6 of them, moving in the coordinated pattern of experienced warriors. Even at distance, their distinctive silhouettes and the way they managed their horses marked them unmistakably as Lakota. "War party?" Coleman breathed, abandoning his position at the back door. "We're surrounded." Harrison's face hardened as the tactical situation shifted dramatically. "How many?" 6 visible, probably more in the trees, Davis reported. "They're spreading out, trying to encircle the cabin." Eleanor's mind reeled as she realized the approaching riders were likely Dakota's hunting party, finally tracking their missing member to her homestead. What had begun as a simple act of mercy had escalated into a 3-way confrontation between cavalry soldiers, Lakota warriors, and a massive predator that seemed determined to break down her door. The mountain lion chose that moment to achieve a breakthrough. Its latest assault opened a gap large enough for the beast to force its massive head through the splintered door. Yellow eyes blazed with triumph as powerful jaws snapped at the empty air, seeking the scent trail that had led. "It here!" "Shoot it," Harrison commanded, but the angle was wrong for a clean shot. The cougar's body remained protected by the door frame, while only its head was visible. Eleanor found herself moving without conscious decision, grabbing a heavy iron skillet from beside the stove. As the mountain lion struggled to widen the gap, She brought the pan down with all her strength across the beast's scarred muzzle. The impact produced a wet crack that echoed through the cabin. The cougar recoiled with a shriek of pain and rage, pulling back through the gap. But instead of retreating, the wounded predator's fury intensified. It began circling the cabin with measured strides, seeking alternative entry points while blood dripped from its injured nose. "Good shot," Harrison acknowledged grimly, but that just made it angrier. Through the window, Eleanor could see the Lakota riders had stopped just beyond rifle range. They sat their horses with the patience of experienced hunters, studying the situation while remaining ready to respond to any threat. She counted 7 warriors now, their faces painted for war, but their weapons not yet drawn. "They're waiting," Davis observed. "But for what?" Eleanor suspected she knew. If this was indeed Dakota's hunting party, they would have tracked his trail to this location. They might even have heard the mountain lion's roars and realized their missing member was in mortal danger. But they also faced armed cavalry soldiers who would likely shoot on sight. The tactical balance was precarious. The soldiers couldn't abandon the cabin with a mountain lion prowling outside, but they also couldn't ignore the war party that might attack at any moment. Meanwhile, the Lakota warriors couldn't approach without risking a firefight. But neither could they withdraw if one of their own was trapped inside. "Mrs. Whitmore," Harrison said quietly, never taking his eyes off the warriors, "I'm going to ask you one final time. Who is hiding in your attic?" Eleanor looked at the splintered door, the circling predator, and the armed men poised for violence. Every instinct screamed at her to confess, to throw herself on military mercy and hope for understanding. But she also thought of Dakota, wounded and alone above, depending on her protection. "A boy," she said finally. "A Lakota boy who was attacked by that cougar. I've been trying to help him heal." Harrison's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw his grip tighten on his weapon. "How long has he been here?" "Since yesterday morning. He was badly hurt, bleeding, nearly unconscious when I found him." "And you didn't think to report this to the authorities?" Eleanor met his stare directly. "He's a child, Sergeant. A wounded child who needed medical attention. I gave it to him." "A child who led a war party directly to your cabin," Davis interjected angrily. "A child whose people are probably planning to kill us all." "Look at them," Eleanor countered, gesturing toward the window. "If they wanted to attack, they would have done it already. They're here because they're worried about their missing member." The mountain lion's roar interrupted their debate, closer now as the beast completed another circuit of the cabin. Through gaps in the shutters, Eleanor caught glimpses of tawny fur and burning eyes as the predator sought weaknesses in the structure's defenses. "It's looking for a way in," Coleman observed nervously. "What happens when it finds one?" Before anyone could answer, a new sound penetrated the morning air, a human voice calling out in Lakota. The words carried clearly across the open ground, between the cabin and the warriors, though none of the soldiers understood their meaning. Eleanor, however, recognized the tone, if not the language. Someone was calling a name over and over, with the desperation of family seeking a lost member. "They're calling for the boy," she translated quietly. Harrison studied her face, reading the truth in her expression. "The boy you've been hiding is related to those warriors." "I think so. He mentioned an uncle who led the hunting party." The sergeant absorbed this information while calculating rapidly shifting odds. 3 cavalry soldiers faced 7 Lakota warriors and a mountain lion, with a civilian woman and wounded boy complicating any military response. Conventional tactics demanded immediate evacuation or calling for reinforcement, but the geography made both options impossible. "Can the boy travel?" Harrison asked suddenly. Eleanor blinked, surprised by the question. "With help, maybe." "Why?" "Because," the sergeant said grimly, watching the warriors through the window, "I think those people out there are our only chance of getting out of this alive." The admission struck Eleanor like lightning. A career cavalry officer was acknowledging that cooperation with Lakota warriors offered better survival odds than military confrontation. The realization opened possibilities she'd never dared imagine. But before she could respond, the mountain lion found what it had been seeking. A tremendous crash from the rear of the cabin announced the beast's discovery of the root cellar entrance. Eleanor heard splintering wood and tearing metal as powerful claws ripped away the storm doors that protected the underground storage area. "It's coming through the cellar!" Coleman shouted, raising his rifle toward the floor. Eleanor's heart hammered as she realized the mountain lion would emerge directly beneath the ladder leading to Dakota's hiding place. The predator's instincts were leading it straight to its quarry through a route none of them had adequately protected. The sound of heavy paws on stone steps echoed through the cabin floor as the great cat began its ascent from the root cellar. In seconds, it would burst through the interior entrance, bringing 200 pounds of muscle, claw, and fang into direct contact with 4 humans and 1 wounded boy. Eleanor gripped her rifle tighter, knowing that everything she'd sacrificed to protect was about to be decided in the next few moments. The point of no return had arrived, with the thunderous approach of death itself, rising from the darkness below like a nightmare given flesh. Outside, the Lakota warriors sat their horses in tense readiness, unaware that their missing member was about to face the predator that had nearly killed him once before. Inside, soldiers who had come to arrest now prepared to defend the very person they'd sought to capture. The cabin trembled as something massive struck the cellar door from beneath. Testing its strength, Eleanor realized with crystal clarity that the next few minutes would either validate her choice to show mercy or condemn everyone present to a violent death. She had chosen compassion over caution, humanity over policy, and now the consequences were rising from the depths like an ancient evil seeking blood. The cellar door exploded upward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal hinges. The mountain lion erupted through the opening like a force of nature unleashed, its massive frame filling the narrow stairwell as yellow eyes swept the cabin interior with predatory intelligence. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized the beast was even larger than she'd estimated, its scarred shoulders nearly touching the ceiling beams as it gathered itself for attack. Sergeant Harrison's rifle cracked in the confined space, the bullet scoring a furrow along the cougar's flank without stopping its advance. The wounded predator's roar shook dust from the rafters as it launched itself toward the ladder leading to Dakota's hiding place, instinct overriding pain in its drive to reach the source of the blood scent that had drawn it here. "Dakota, stay down!" Eleanor shouted, abandoning any pretense of concealment as she fired her Winchester at the climbing beast. Her shot struck home, punching through muscle below the cat's left shoulder blade, but the mountain lion's momentum carried it halfway up the ladder before the wound forced it to release its grip. The great cat dropped to the cabin floor with bone-jarring impact, landing mere feet from where Davis crouched with his carbine. The soldier's close-range shot caught the predator in the chest, finally eliciting a sound of genuine distress as the cougar staggered backward, crimson foam speckling its muzzle. But rather than retreat, the wounded mountain lion's fury intensified. It whirled toward Davis with lightning speed, massive paws slashing through the air where the soldier's head had been an instant before. Only Coleman's timely tackle saved his comrade, both men crashing into Eleanor's kitchen table as claws raked through empty space. "It's not going down!" Harrison yelled, working the bolt of his rifle while keeping the weapon trained on the circling predator. Things too big, too mean to drop easy. Eleanor realized the truth of his words with growing horror. They were facing not just a mountain lion, but an apex predator in its prime, wounded and enraged but far from defeated. The confined space that should have been their advantage was becoming a death trap as the massive cat used its superior agility to avoid their shots while positioning for another attack. From above came the sound of movement as Lakota shifted, position in the cramped attic space. The boy was trying to see what was happening below, unaware that his motion was drawing the mountain lion's attention back to its original target. Eleanor watched in terror as the great cat's scarred head tilted upward, nostrils flaring as it caught fresh traces of its quarry's scent. The predator gathered itself for another leap toward the ladder, muscles bunching under blood-matted fur. Eleanor knew that if it reached Lakota in the confined attic space, neither she nor the soldiers could intervene effectively. The boy would face the same creature that had killed his horse and nearly ended his life, this time with no escape route available. But before the mountain lion could launch its attack, a new sound penetrated the cabin's walls, the rhythmic thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, Eleanor saw the Lakota warriors spurring their horses toward the homestead at a full gallop, war cries echoing across the valley as they abandoned their cautious observation for direct action. "They're attacking!" Coleman gasped, struggling to extract himself from the wreckage of the kitchen table. "No," Eleanor said with sudden understanding. "They're coming to help." Harrison shot her a skeptical look while keeping his rifle trained. "On the mountain lion?" "Help who? Us or the cat?" "The boy." They heard the shots and realized he's in danger. The sergeant's expression shifted as he processed this possibility. "You think they'll distinguish between threats?" Before Eleanor could respond, the lead Lakota warrior reached the cabin's shattered porch. Through gaps in the splintered door, she glimpsed a lean figure with graying hair and intelligent eyes, his face painted with symbols she didn't recognize, but which radiated authority. The warrior called out in rapid Lakota, his voice carrying both urgency and command. From the attic came an immediate response, Lakota's voice weak but clearly relieved. The exchange lasted only seconds, but Eleanor could hear the emotional reunion in their tones. The boy was confirming his presence and condition, while the warrior, likely his uncle, assessed the situation. "What are they saying?" Harrison demanded, sweat beading his forehead as he tracked the mountain lion's restless pacing. "Family reunion," Eleanor replied tersely, then raised her voice toward the door. "The cougar's inside. It's wounded but still dangerous." She wasn't sure if the warrior outside understood English, but her tone needed no translation. The urgency in her voice communicated the immediate threat more effectively than any shared language could have managed. The response came not in words, but in action. 3 more Lakota warriors dismounted and moved to flank the cabin, their movements coordinated. With the precision of experienced hunters, Eleanor realized they were treating the mountain lion like a dangerous game, applying tactics developed through generations of hunting large predators in challenging terrain. "They know what they're doing," she observed quietly. Harrison's military training warred with frontier prejudices as he watched the Lakota warriors position themselves. Professional soldiers cooperating with hostiles violates every regulation in the manual. "Regulations don't cover mountain lions in confined spaces," Eleanor pointed out. "Right now, we need all the help we can get." The wounded cougar seemed to sense the changing dynamics outside the cabin. Its pacing became more agitated as new scents reached its sensitive nose, human odors carrying the musk of horses and leather, war paint and steel. The beast's survival instincts recognized that the odds were shifting against it. A sharp whistle from outside preceded coordinated action. 2 Lakota warriors appeared at windows on opposite sides of the cabin, their bows drawn and arrows nocked. Eleanor marveled at their ability to move silently despite the chaos, appearing like ghosts at precisely the right moments. The mountain lion whirled toward the eastern window as one warrior deliberately showed himself, providing a target that drew the predator's attention. As the great cat gathered itself to spring toward this new threat, the warrior at the opposite window released his arrow. The shaft struck deep between the mountain lion's ribs, angled upward toward vital organs with the precision that spoke of countless successful hunts. The cougar's roar transformed into a bubbling shriek as the broadhead found its mark, finally inflicting damage that genuine threatened its life. But the wounded beast's final surge of strength carried it toward the window where the archer had revealed himself. Only Harrison's quick thinking prevented disaster as the sergeant's rifle spoke again, his bullet catching the mountain lion in mid-leap and slamming it sideways into the cabin wall. The impact shook the entire structure, but this time the great cat didn't rise. It lay against the overturned table, massive chest heaving as life ebbed from wounds no creature could survive. Yellow eyes that had burned with predatory fire began to dim as the ancient hunter faced its final defeat. Eleanor lowered her rifle with trembling hands, hardly believing the violence was over. Around the cabin, Lakota warriors emerged from concealment while soldiers maintained their positions, both groups eyeing each other with mixture of respect and continued wariness. "Stand down," Harrison ordered his men quietly. "Let's see what happens next." The warrior Eleanor had glimpsed through the door and entered through the shattered opening, stepping carefully around the dying mountain lion while keeping his hands visible and empty of weapons. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd initially estimated, perhaps 50, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent his life in a harsh country. But his bearing radiated the quiet authority of a leader accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "I am Joseph Standing Bear," he said in careful English, inclining his head respectfully toward Eleanor. "You are the woman who saved my nephew." The formal introduction surprised Eleanor with its dignity and directness. "Eleanor Whitmore, and yes, I've been caring for Dakota since yesterday morning." Standing Bear's gaze moved to the soldiers, assessing their threat level with the same clinical evaluation he might apply to dangerous game. "These men came to take him?" "They came looking for Lakota war parties," Eleanor replied honestly. "I didn't tell them about Dakota until the mountain lion forced everything into the open." Harrison stepped forward slowly, his rifle lowered but ready. "Sergeant William Harrison, 2nd Cavalry. Your nephew was reported as part of a hostile force threatening this territory." "My nephew is 14 years old," Standing Bear replied, with calm authority. "He got lost following the elk and was attacked by the cat we just killed. There is no war party here, only hunters searching for missing family." The simple explanation carried weight precisely because of its mundane nature. Eleanor watched Harrison processing this information, military suspicion warring with common sense. A lost boy was far more plausible than an elaborate Lakota conspiracy, especially given the evidence of the mountain lion attack. "You tracked him here?" the sergeant asked. "For 3 days. Found his horse killed by a cat, followed a blood trail, and hoofprints to this place." Standing Bear gestured toward Eleanor. "Woman showed courage by protecting wounded child. This is a sacred thing among my people." Coleman emerged from behind the overturned furniture, carbine still ready, but no longer threatening. "So this whole thing was just a family rescue mission?" "Family is everything," Standing Bear confirmed simply. "Would you not search for lost child?" The question hung in the air, carrying implications that transcended cultural boundaries. Eleanor watched understanding dawn in the soldiers' faces as they recognized universal human motivations beneath surface differences. From the attic came sounds of movement as Dakota began his careful descent down the ladder. The boy appeared pale and shaky, but managed the climb with determination that impressed the watching adults. Standing Bear moved to support his nephew's final steps, speaking quietly in Lakota while examining the bandages Eleanor had applied. "You did good work," he told Eleanor with genuine gratitude. "Wounds are clean, healing properly. You have medicine knowledge." "Just what I learned from necessity," Eleanor replied, though she felt pride at the warrior's professional assessment. "He's a brave boy. Didn't complain once while I cleaned and stitched the cuts." Dakota looked up at her with shy gratitude before turning to face the soldiers who had been hunting him. Eleanor held her breath, wondering how the boy would react to armed representatives of the army that had been pursuing his people. "Thank you for helping kill the cat," Dakota said formally, his English more careful in front of his uncle. "It would have found me in a hiding place." Harrison studied the boy's earnest face, seeing not the dangerous warrior intelligence had described, but exactly what Eleanor had been trying to tell them. A wounded child, grateful for protection. The sergeant's expression softened slightly as preconceptions crumbled under reality's assault. "You're welcome, son. That was one hell of a big cat." Standing Bear translated for the other warriors, who had gathered outside the cabin but maintained respectful distance from the armed soldiers. Eleanor listened to the rapid Lakota conversation, hearing what sounded like explanations and reassurances rather than war planning. "My men want to thank soldiers for protecting my nephew," Standing Bear explained. "Among Lakota, those who help family become family. This creates an obligation." Davis shifted uncomfortably at the concept of obligation to Indians, but Harrison seemed more thoughtful. "What kind of obligation?" "Sacred debt. You risked lives for a Lakota child. Now Lakota must protect you if needed." Standing Bear's expression grew serious. "This is a law older than treaties, stronger than war, cannot be broken." Eleanor felt a chill of recognition as she realized the implications. Her simple act of mercy had created bonds that transcended political boundaries, establishing relationships that might influence events far beyond this remote cabin. The boy she'd bandaged had become a bridge between worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "there's something you should know. When I found Dakota, he mentioned his hunting party had been gone for 5 days. They've been searching that long for one lost boy." Harrison absorbed this information, his military mind calculating the dedication required for such an extended search. 5 days of dangerous mountain travel, facing early winter weather and potential military patrols, demonstrated commitment that challenged every stereotype about savage disregard for human life. "That's a long time to risk exposure for one person," he acknowledged. "Family is worth any risk," Standing Bear stated simply. "Same for people who protect their family." The profound simplicity of the warrior's philosophy struck Eleanor with unexpected force. In the complex world of territorial politics and military strategy, the Lakota had maintained focus on fundamental human values that transcended artificial boundaries. Dakota had been listening to the adult conversation while leaning against the wall for support. Now he spoke up with the directness of youth unencumbered by diplomatic niceties. "Uncle, white medicine woman has no family. Husband dead, no children. She live alone, dangerous for woman." Standing Bear's eyes moved to Eleanor with new interest. "This is true," Eleanor nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I've managed alone for 3 years now. And you chose to help an enemy child when you could have let nature take its course," Standing Bear mused. "Why?" The question went to the heart of everything that had transpired. Eleanor considered her answer carefully, aware that her words might influence relationships between peoples balanced on the edge of war. "Because he needed help, and I could provide it. That seemed more important than who his people were or what mine might think about it." Standing Bear translated for his warriors, who responded with nods and murmurs of approval. Eleanor realized she had passed some kind of test, demonstrating qualities that earned respect across cultural boundaries. "Among my people," Standing Bear said formally, "woman who shows such courage is called Spirit Walker, one who sees beyond the surface to truth underneath. This is a rare gift, valued above gold or horses." Harrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to practical matters. This is all very touching, but I still have to file a report about this incident. How do I explain a cooperative engagement with a Lakota war party? Not a war party, Standing Bear corrected firmly. Search party, looking for a lost family member who was found safe because of white woman's kindness. Truth is always the best explanation. The simple wisdom of the statement impressed Eleanor with its directness. Truth was indeed the best explanation, even when that truth complicated official narratives about frontier conflict. What happens now? She asked, looking between the Lakota leader and the cavalry sergeant. Standing Bear and Harrison exchanged a long look, two professional soldiers evaluating possibilities that neither had imagined an hour earlier. The foundations of everything they'd been taught about each other had shifted during the crisis. They'd just survived together. Now, Standing Bear said slowly, we begin to discover what peace might look like when good people choose to see humanity in supposed enemies. His words carried the weight of prophecy, suggesting transformations that could ripple far beyond this isolated mountain cabin. Eleanor realized that her choice to shelter an injured boy had become the first step in a journey whose destination none of them could yet envision. Outside, the mountain wind continued to howl across Devil's Ridge, but now it carried with it the scent of possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours before. 3 days after the mountain lion's death, Eleanor woke to an ominous sound that made her blood run cold, the thunder of many horses approaching fast across Devil's Ridge. From her bedroom window she could see dust clouds rising in the pre-dawn darkness, backlit by torches that suggested a large mounted force moving with military precision. Her heart hammered as she realized this wasn't the careful approach of hunters or traders, but the aggressive advance of armed men intent on confrontation. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch, where Dakota sat keeping watch despite his healing wounds. The boy's face was grave as he studied the approaching riders, counting their numbers with the practiced eye of someone raised in a world where such assessments meant survival. How many? Eleanor asked quietly. 30 soldiers, maybe more, and civilians behind them. Dakota's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications. They come for war, not talk. Eleanor's stomach dropped as she realized what this meant. Word of the cooperative engagement between cavalry soldiers and Lakota warriors had reached higher authorities, and the response was exactly what she'd feared. A military force large enough to overwhelm any resistance and restore what headquarters would consider proper order. Standing Bear emerged from the barn where he'd been tending the horses, his weathered face reading the tactical situation with professional clarity. Over the past 3 days, he and 2 of his warriors had remained at Eleanor's homestead, partly to ensure Dakota's continued recovery, and partly out of the sacred obligation he'd described to protect those who had protected family. Time to leave, he said simply, moving toward where the Lakota horses were picketed. Army comes in force. They will not listen to explanations. But Dakota struggled to his feet, wincing as healing wounds protested the movement. No running. Makes us look guilty. Makes a medicine woman look like a liar. Eleanor felt her world tilting as she faced an impossible choice. If the Lakota fled, it would confirm military suspicions about her collaboration with hostiles, likely resulting in charges that could see her imprisoned or worse. But if they remained, the arriving force would almost certainly treat them as enemy combatants, leading to a firefight that could cost lives on both sides. The boy's right, she said slowly. Running now destroys everything we've tried to build these past 3 days. Standing Bear's expression showed he understood the logic, even as he disagreed with the conclusion. Sometimes survival matters more than honor, Spirit Walker. Dead people cannot build bridges. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Eleanor could now make out individual riders in the torchlight. At the column's head rode a figure she recognized with sinking heart, Colonel Marcus Thornfield, Fort Steele's commanding officer, whose reputation for harsh treatment of indigenous peoples was legendary throughout the territory. "Colonel Thornfield," she breathed, "this isn't going to be a diplomatic conversation." Lakota looked between the adults, reading the fear in their expressions. "Who is this man?" "Someone who believes the only good Indian is a dead Indian," Eleanor replied grimly. "He's been advocating for total war against the Lakota for months." Standing Bear's hand moved unconsciously toward his weapons, then stopped as he reminded himself that violence would only confirm Thornfield's worst assumptions. "Then we face a test of everything we have learned about each other. Can friendship survive when authority demands hatred?" The question hung in the morning air as 30 cavalry soldiers formed a battle line facing Eleanor's cabin. Behind them came a dozen civilians, armed settlers, whose faces reflected the fear and anger that had driven them to join this expedition. Eleanor recognized several neighbors, including the Morrison family from down the valley and old Henrik Peterson, whose homestead lay 20 miles south. Colonel Thornfield dismounted with theatrical precision, his tall frame imposing in full dress uniform complete with ceremonial sword. His steel-gray hair and hard features made him look like a figure carved from granite, uncompromising and severe. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore," he announced formally, "by order of the Territorial Governor and the United States Army, you are under arrest for providing aid and comfort to enemy combatants." Eleanor felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Military arrest meant court-martial, military justice, and almost certain conviction given the political climate. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. "Colonel Thornfield." Sergeant Harrison emerged from behind the cabin where he'd been inspecting damage from the mountain lion's assault. "I need to speak with you about the actual circumstances here." Thornfield's eyes narrowed as he recognized his subordinate. "Sergeant Harrison, I ordered you to report back to Fort Steele 3 days ago. Your failure to do so will be addressed through appropriate channels." "Sir, with respect, the situation here required continued observation to ensure accurate reporting." Harrison moved to stand beside Eleanor, a gesture that spoke volumes about loyalties shaped by shared danger. "What we discovered contradicts initial intelligence reports. Are you questioning military intelligence, Sergeant?" "I'm reporting facts that intelligence failed to uncover, sir." Harrison's voice remained respectful but firm. "The Lakota presence here was a family rescue mission, not hostile reconnaissance. Mrs. Whitmore provided medical aid to a wounded child, nothing more." Thornfield's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "And you believed their lies? Sergeant, you've been away from civilization too long if you think savages are capable of family sentiment." Eleanor watched Standing Bear's face during this exchange, seeing how carefully he controlled his reaction to Thornfield's casual dehumanization. The Lakota leader understood that any display of anger would be interpreted as confirmation of savage nature, undermining everything they'd tried to accomplish. "The boy was genuinely injured," Eleanor interjected. "Attacked by a mountain lion, bleeding, nearly unconscious when I found him. What was I supposed to do? Let a child die?" "You were supposed to report the presence of hostiles to proper authorities." Thornfield snapped. "Instead, you chose to harbor enemies of the United States, providing them with intelligence about military movements and civilian vulnerabilities." The accusation was so far from reality that Eleanor felt momentarily speechless, but before she could formulate a response, Lakota stepped forward despite his uncle's restraining hand. "I tell you the truth," the boy said with quiet dignity. "Medicine. Woman saved my life when a mountain cat attacked. She clean wounds, give food, protect from soldiers who want to hurt wounded child. She is a good person, not an enemy. Thornfield's eyes fixed on Lakota with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. And you, young savage, are exactly the kind of decoy these people use to infiltrate civilized communities. How many white families has your tribe murdered while playing the innocent victim? Colonel, Harrison interrupted. The boy's injuries were genuine. I examined them myself. No one could fake wounds that severe. Physical injuries can be self-inflicted to support deception, Thornfield replied coldly. These people are more cunning than you credit, Sergeant. They understand how Christian sympathy can be exploited by those who know how to manipulate appearances. Eleanor realized with growing horror that Thornfield had already decided on his version of events before arriving at her homestead. No amount of evidence or testimony would change his predetermined narrative about savage deception and white victimization. But Standing Bear chose that moment to step forward, moving with the fluid grace that marked him as a man comfortable with violence, but choosing restraint. When he spoke, his English carried formal cadences that suggested education and intelligence that challenged every stereotype. Colonel Thornfield, he said with quiet dignity, I am Joseph Standing Bear, War Chief of the Wind River Band. The boy you accuse of deception is my nephew, son of my sister, lost for 5 days in mountains during elk hunt. This woman found him dying and chose mercy over fear. For this, she has earned eternal gratitude of my people. Thornfield's face flushed with anger at being addressed directly by a Lakota leader. I don't negotiate with hostiles. Your very presence here constitutes an act of war against the United States. My presence here constitutes an act of gratitude towards someone who saved a family member, Standing Bear replied calmly. Among my people, such debts are sacred. They cannot be ignored for political convenience. The exchange was drawing lines that would determine everything that followed. Eleanor recognized that she was witnessing a crucial moment where individual choices would either advance understanding or confirm the inevitability of continued warfare. That's exactly the problem, Thornfield replied sharply. Good people making bad decisions because they can't recognize the nature of the enemy they're facing. Sentiment has no place in frontier security. But Peterson wasn't finished. What about the mountain lion they killed together? Harrison told us how soldiers and Indians worked together to bring down a predator that threatened everyone. Doesn't that count for something? Eleanor felt a surge of hope as she realized not all the civilians had come seeking confrontation. Some, like Peterson, seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had actually transpired rather than confirming. Preconceived notions, Thornfield's expression hardened further. Temporary cooperation against a common threat doesn't erase fundamental antagonisms. These people remain enemies of civilization, regardless of momentary tactical alliances. With respect, sir, Harrison interjected, the cooperation I witnessed went beyond tactical necessity. It demonstrated shared values that transcend cultural boundaries. Sergeant Harrison, Thornfield's voice carried the chill of military discipline. You will be silent until I request your input. Your judgment has clearly been compromised by prolonged exposure to hostile propaganda. The dismissal of Harrison's first-hand observations struck Eleanor as fundamentally unjust. The sergeant had witnessed everything that transpired, yet his testimony was being rejected simply because it contradicted predetermined conclusions. Standing Bear seemed to recognize the futility of a reasoned argument with Thornfield. Instead, he turned to address the assembled civilians directly, speaking with the formal dignity of a chief addressing a council. People of the valley, he said clearly, I came here to recover my lost nephew, nothing more. Found him saved by a woman with a healing spirit who asked nothing in return for kindness. This is not enemy behavior. This is sacred behavior that my people honor above all else. Mrs. Morrison, a stern woman whose family had suffered losses during previous Indian raids, studied Standing Bear with suspicious eyes. How do we know this isn't all deception? How do we know you're not scouting our weaknesses while pretending gratitude? The question went to the heart of frontier anxiety, the persistent fear that kindness would be repaid with violence. Eleanor understood that Mrs. Morrison's suspicion grew from genuine loss and trauma, making her distrust both logical and tragic. Standing Bear met her gaze directly. Because if my people wanted to attack this valley, we would not announce our presence or engage in lengthy conversations with armed soldiers. We would strike in darkness and disappear before dawn, as we have done when such actions were necessary. His blunt honesty about Lakota military capabilities sent a ripple of unease through the assembled civilians. But Eleanor recognized the wisdom in his approach, acknowledging rather than denying Lakota strength while emphasizing their choice to use that strength for protection rather than aggression. "Then why are you still here?" Morrison demanded. "If you got your nephew back, why haven't you left?" "Because," Standing Bear replied simply, "sacred debt requires protection of those who showed kindness to family. Medicine Woman now belongs to an extended kinship network. Her safety is my responsibility." Thornfield seized on this declaration with obvious satisfaction. There you have it. An admission that these hostiles consider Mrs. Whitmore their property, subject to their protection rather than American law. "That's not what he said," Eleanor protested. "He's talking about friendship, about obligation based on gratitude. He's talking about claiming jurisdiction over an American citizen," Thornfield countered, "which constitutes an act of war against the United States." Eleanor realized that Thornfield was determined to twist every statement into evidence supporting his predetermined conclusion about Lakota hostility. No amount of explanation or clarification would change his mind, because he needed conflict to justify the harsh policies he'd been advocating. But then Private Coleman, who had fought alongside the Lakota warriors against the mountain lion, stepped forward from the cavalry ranks. "Colonel, sir, I was here when the fighting happened. I saw how those Indians fought to protect all of us, not just their own people." Thornfield's eyes blazed with fury at this second challenge to his authority. "Private Coleman, return to ranks immediately. Your observations are not relevant to command decisions." "But, sir, shouldn't the truth be relevant?" Coleman persisted with the courage of youth challenging injustice. "Shouldn't what actually happened matter more than what we expected to happen?" The question crystallized the fundamental conflict between predetermined ideology and observed reality. Eleanor watched as other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their first-hand knowledge conflicting with official doctrine in ways that challenged everything they'd been taught to believe. Thornfield's face had turned dangerous shades of red as subordinates continued questioning his judgment. "I will have order in this command. Any further insubordination will result in immediate court-martial." But the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted in minds that had witnessed events contradicting official narratives. Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing out across multiple faces as good soldiers wrestled with conflicting loyalties. Standing Bear seemed to recognize the moment's significance. Instead of speaking to Thornfield, he addressed the assembled group with the voice of someone offering wisdom earned through hard experience. "In my 60 winters I have seen much war, much hatred between peoples. Always it begins the same way. Fear of other, belief that difference means danger. But sometimes wise people choose to see past fear to truth underneath." He gestured toward Eleanor and Dakota, uncle and nephew, united by shared ordeal. Medicine Woman chose to see wounded child instead of enemy warrior. My nephew chose to trust healing instead of harboring hatred. Sergeant Harrison chose to believe Evidence instead of expectation, these choices created something new, something that gives hope for a better future. The simplicity and dignity of his words created a moment of profound silence. Eleanor realized that Standing Bear was offering everyone a choice between the familiar patterns of conflict and the uncertain possibility of peace. Thornfield broke the silence with harsh laughter. Pretty words from a savage trying to avoid the consequences of his aggression. But I deal in facts, not feelings. Mrs. Whitmore harbored enemy combatants. These Indians trespassed on American territory. Military law is clear about appropriate responses. Eleanor felt desperation rising as she realized that reason and evidence were proving powerless against ideological certainty. Thornfield represented everything that made frontier peace impossible: the inability to see humanity in designated enemies, the refusal to acknowledge complexity in situations defined as simple, the insistence on military solutions to problems that required human understanding. But then Henrik Peterson spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived decades on the frontier through practical wisdom rather than theoretical knowledge. "Colonel, I've got a question for you. If these Indians are as dangerous as you claim, why haven't they killed us all by now? They've had 3 days with Mrs. Whitmore, opportunity to learn everything about our defenses and capabilities. If they're really scouts for war parties, where are the attacks?" The question struck at the heart of Thornfield's narrative logic. Eleanor watched the colonel struggle to formulate a response that maintained his position while addressing obvious contradictions. "Their plans may simply require more time to develop," Thornfield replied, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Or maybe," Peterson continued relentlessly, "they're telling the truth about being here for family reasons. Maybe sometimes things are exactly what they appear to be instead of elaborate conspiracies." Other civilians were nodding now, their practical frontier experience aligning with Peterson's common-sense assessment. Eleanor felt hope stirring as she realized that ordinary people might prove more open to evidence than military authority. Standing Bear seized the opening that Peterson's questions had created. "I make an offer that proves my intentions. My warriors and I will leave this place, return to our people, and send message to all bands about Medicine Woman's kindness. But if any harm comes to her because of help she gave my nephew, all treaties are finished. Sacred debt becomes sacred vengeance." The threat was delivered with quiet dignity, but its implications struck everyone present like lightning. Standing Bear was offering to withdraw, while simultaneously making clear that Eleanor's safety had become a matter of tribal honor that would override political considerations. Thornfield's face darkened at this challenge to his authority. "You don't dictate terms to the United States Army, savage." "I don't dictate," Standing Bear replied calmly. "I simply state reality. Harm to Medicine Woman breaks sacred law. Broken. Sacred law requires blood payment. This is not a threat. This is explanation of consequences that cannot be avoided." Eleanor realized that Standing Bear was creating a protective shield around her, using the only currency that frontier politics understood: the credible threat of retaliation. By making her safety a matter of tribal honor, he was ensuring that practical men would think twice before allowing her to be harmed. But Thornfield was beyond practical considerations, driven by ideological fury at seeing his authority challenged by those he considered subhuman. "I don't negotiate with terrorists, and I don't accept ultimatums from savages. Mrs. Whitmore will face military justice for her crimes, and these hostiles will be dealt with according to standing orders." The colonel's hand moved toward his service revolver, and Eleanor felt the moment crystallizing toward inevitable violence. Everything that had been built through cooperation and understanding was about to be destroyed by the refusal to see humanity in designated enemies. But then Lakota stepped forward, placing himself between the armed adults, despite his healing wounds and obvious vulnerability. When he spoke, his young voice carried a wisdom that transcended his years. "Please," he said simply, "no more fighting, no more killing. Medicine Woman showed me that people can choose kindness over fear. Sergeant Harrison showed me that soldiers can choose truth over orders. Uncle showed me that warriors can choose protection over war. All of you can choose to let healing continue instead of breaking it apart." The boy's words hung in the morning air like a prayer for sanity in a world gone mad with hatred. Eleanor felt tears forming as she realized that Lakota, who had suffered most from the conflicts between their peoples, was offering the clearest vision of what peace might look like. But even as hope stirred in her heart, she knew that the moment, balanced on a knife's edge, Thornfield's next decision would either validate everything they'd tried to build or destroy it in a flood of violence that would poison relationships for generations to come. The colonel's hand remained on his weapon as he studied the faces around him, calculating odds and consequences. Eleanor held her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether mercy triumphed over military doctrine or whether the fragile bridge between peoples would be burned in the flames of predetermined hatred. In that tense silence, another voice cut through the morning air with unexpected authority. "Colonel Thornfield, stand down your weapon immediately." Everyone turned to see a figure emerging from the tree line on horseback, moving with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Eleanor's heart leaped as she recognized the uniform of a brigadier general, the silver star gleaming on his shoulder boards even in the dim pre-dawn light. "General Morrison," Thornfield stammered, his hand jerking away from his revolver as if it had become red-hot. "Sir, I wasn't expecting—" "Clearly," the general replied dryly, dismounting, with fluid grace despite his apparent age. As he drew closer, Eleanor could see he was perhaps 60, with steel-grey hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "I've been riding hard for 2 days after receiving some very interesting reports about cooperative engagements between cavalry units and Lakota warriors." Thornfield's face went pale as he realized the implications. "Sir, I can explain the circumstances." "I'm sure you can, Colonel. But first, I'd like to hear from the people who were actually present during these remarkable events." General Morrison's gaze moved to Harrison, who snapped to attention despite his rumpled appearance. "Sergeant, I understand you've spent 3 days observing the situation here. What's your assessment?" Harrison glanced nervously at Thornfield. Before responding, "Sir, the initial intelligence was incorrect. What we encountered was a family rescue mission, not hostile reconnaissance. Mrs. Whitmore provided medical aid to a wounded Lakota boy, and when a mountain lion threatened everyone present, soldiers and warriors worked together to eliminate the threat." "Work together," Morrison repeated thoughtfully. "That's not a phrase I often see in frontier reports. Can you elaborate?" "Yes, sir. The Lakota warriors demonstrated tactical discipline and precision that impressed everyone present. They coordinated their actions with our positions, shared intelligence about the predator's behavior, and showed genuine concern for civilian safety throughout the engagement." Morrison nodded slowly, processing this information. "And the boy in question, is he present?" Lakota stepped forward, still favoring his injured leg, but holding himself with quiet dignity. "I am Lakota, nephew of Joseph Standing Bear. Medicine Woman saved my life when a mountain cat attacked. I owe her sacred debt that can never be repaid." The general studied the boy's earnest face and obvious injuries. "These wounds were inflicted by the mountain lion Sergeant Harrison mentioned?" "Yes, sir," Eleanor interjected. "I can show you the medical records I kept, documenting the treatment provided. 3 deep lacerations on the shoulder, puncture wounds on the thigh, possible concussion from the initial attack." "Medical records," Morrison mused. "How very thorough of you, Mrs. Whitmore, and you're a trained nurse." "Self-taught from necessity, General. 3 years of frontier life teaches practical medicine, whether you want to learn it or not." Morrison's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Indeed it does. And Mr. Standing Bear, I believe. I've heard your name in various reports over the years. You're considered a formidable war chief by those who've faced you in battle. Standing Bear inclined his head respectfully. I fight when fighting is necessary, General. I seek peace when peace is possible. This woman made peace possible by choosing mercy over fear. An interesting perspective. Morrison turned back to Thornfield, whose earlier confidence had evaporated, under his superior's questioning. Colonel, your report suggested Mrs. Whitmore was collaborating with hostile forces to gather intelligence for future attacks. What evidence supports this assessment? Thornfield struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't make him appear foolish. Sir, harboring enemy combatants is a clear violation of territorial law, regardless of claimed humanitarian motivations. Enemy combatants, Morrison repeated. You're referring to a wounded 14-year-old boy and the family members who came to rescue him? Sir, age doesn't eliminate the threat posed by hostile Indians. Intelligence suggests many things, Colonel. I'm more interested in observed facts. Morrison gestured toward the cabin, where damage from the mountain lion's assault was still visible. I see evidence of significant property damage here. Was this the result of the Indian attack? No, sir, Harrison answered when Thornfield hesitated. That damage was caused by the mountain lion when it forced entry through the root cellar. The predator was tracking the boy's scent and became increasingly aggressive as it got closer to its target. Morrison examined the splintered door and claw marks with professional interest. Remarkable. I've never seen a mountain lion attempt to break into a structure with this kind of determination. What finally brought it down? Coordinated fire from multiple positions, sir, Coleman spoke up from the ranks. The Lakota warriors positioned themselves to create crossfire while we maintained suppressive fire from inside. Without their tactical support, casualties would have been much higher. Private Coleman raises an interesting point, Morrison observed. In your experience, Colonel, do enemy combatants typically risk their lives to protect American soldiers from predator attacks? Thornfield's face reddened as he realized how his own narrative was being systematically dismantled. Sir, I believe these people are more cunning than we've credited. This entire situation could be an elaborate deception designed to what exactly? Morrison interrupted. To rescue a genuinely wounded boy through cooperation with American forces. If this is deception, Colonel, it's remarkably sophisticated and seemingly pointless. What intelligence value could possibly justify such an elaborate charade? The question hung in the air while Thornfield struggled with an answer that wouldn't make him appear paranoid or incompetent. Eleanor realized that General Morrison was systematically destroying the colonel's credibility through careful questioning that exposed the logical flaws in his predetermined conclusions. Mrs. Morrison, who had been listening intently to the exchange, suddenly stepped forward. General, sir, are you related to my family? Thomas Morrison was my late husband's brother. Morrison's stern expression softened slightly. Thomas was my cousin, ma'am. I heard about the troubles your family faced during the raids last spring. I'm sorry for your losses. Thank you, sir. Thomas always spoke highly of you. She paused, gathering courage. General, I came here expecting to find proof of Indian treachery, but what I'm hearing doesn't match what Colonel Thornfield told us to expect. What did the Colonel tell you to expect, Mrs. Morrison? That Mrs. Whitmore had been seduced by savage lies into betraying her own people, that she was providing intelligence about our defenses and helping plan attacks on our homesteads. She looked directly at Thornfield as she spoke. But if that's true, why hasn't anything happened? Why are we all still alive and unharmed? Morrison nodded approvingly. An excellent question. Mrs. Morrison raises the fundamental issue. Where are the results of this alleged intelligence gathering? Where are the attacks that should have followed if this were truly an enemy operation? Henrik Peterson stepped forward to support his neighbor. "General, I've known Eleanor Whitmore for 3 years. She's an honest woman who's never shown anything but kindness to everyone in this valley, white or Indian. The idea that she's some kind of spy is just ridiculous." "And yet," Morrison said thoughtfully, "she clearly did harbor a Lakota boy without reporting his presence to authorities. That action, regardless of motivation, technically violated territorial regulations about contact with hostile tribes." Eleanor felt her heart sink as she realized the general might be preparing to uphold Thornfield's charges despite his apparent sympathy. Military law was often inflexible regardless of circumstances, and technical violations remained violations, even when motivated by humanitarian concerns. But Standing Bear stepped forward with the dignity that had impressed everyone who met him. "General Morrison, may I speak about laws and obligations?" Morrison studied the Lakota leader with interest. "Proceed, Mr. Standing Bear." "Among my people, there are laws older than treaties, stronger than politics. When someone saves a family member, sacred debt is created that cannot be ignored. Medicine Woman now belongs to an extended kinship network. Her safety and honor are sacred obligations." "I understand the concept of blood debt," Morrison replied carefully, "but you must understand that Mrs. Whitmore remains subject to American law, regardless of Lakota customs." "Yes," Standing Bear agreed, "but American law also speaks of mercy, of justice, of protecting those who show courage in helping others. If your law punishes kindness, what kind of civilization are you building? In this land?" The question struck home with unexpected force. Eleanor watched Morrison wrestling with competing obligations. Military discipline demanded enforcement of regulations, but justice demanded recognition of exceptional circumstances that transcended simple rule-following. "General," Dakota spoke, up suddenly, his young voice cutting through the adult debate. "May I show you something?" Morrison nodded, curious about what the boy might contribute to the discussion. Dakota limped to Eleanor's side and carefully lifted his shirt to display the healing wounds on his shoulder and ribs. "Medicine Woman cleaned these cuts, sewed them closed, changed bandages every day, gave me food when I was hungry, water when I had fever, warm place to sleep when I was cold." He looked directly at Morrison with the fearless honesty of youth. "This is not enemy behavior. This is holy behavior that my people honor above all else." The simple dignity of the boy's testimony seemed to affect everyone present, including Morrison. Eleanor saw something shift in the general's expression as he recognized the fundamental humanity beneath cultural differences. "Son," Morrison said gently, "those are serious wounds. You're fortunate to have survived both the initial attack and the subsequent infection risk." "Fortune had nothing to do with it," Dakota replied firmly. "Medicine Woman's skill and kindness saved my life. Without her, I would have died alone in the wilderness. My family would never have known what happened to me." Morrison looked around the assembled group, taking in faces that reflected a complex mix of fear, hope, anger, and uncertainty. Eleanor realized he was seeing the same thing she had discovered, that beneath surface antagonisms lay shared human values that transcended artificial boundaries. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said formally, "I came here to investigate reports of either treasonous collaboration or remarkable cooperation, depending on one's perspective. What I've found is something more complex than either extreme." He moved to stand beside Eleanor, his presence lending official weight to whatever decision he was about to announce. "Mrs. Whitmore, you clearly violated territorial regulations by failing to report contact with members of a tribe currently considered hostile by federal authorities." Eleanor's heart sank as she prepared for the arrest she'd been dreading, but Morrison wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "those same regulations were written without contemplating situations where humanitarian aid might serve broader peace objectives. Your actions, while technically illegal, may have accomplished more for frontier stability than months of conventional military operations. Thornfield's face showed his shock at this unexpected turn. General, surely you're not suggesting that violation of standing orders? I'm suggesting, Colonel, that blind adherence to regulations without consideration of exceptional circumstances is poor leadership. Morrison's voice carried the chill of superior authority asserting itself. Mrs. Whitmore's actions created an opportunity for positive engagement that your approach would have destroyed through unnecessary violence. Eleanor felt hope stirring as she realized Morrison might be preparing to take a different approach than anyone had expected. The general's next words confirmed her growing optimism. Mr. Standing Bear, your offer to ensure Mrs. Whitmore's safety through what you call sacred obligation raises interesting possibilities. Would this protection extend to guaranteeing no hostile actions by Lakota forces against civilians in this valley? Standing Bear considered the question carefully. I speak only for my own band, General, but sacred debt creates sacred responsibility. Harm to a medicine woman or her neighbors would dishonor everything she has given us. My warriors and I would be bound to prevent such dishonor. In other words, Morrison said slowly, Mrs. Whitmore's act of mercy has created a protective relationship that could benefit the entire civilian population of this area. That is correct. Morrison turned back to Thornfield with an expression that suggested the Colonel's career prospects were about to change dramatically. Colonel, it appears that unconventional diplomacy has achieved what conventional military pressure has failed to accomplish, a guarantee of civilian protection from hostile action. Sir, you can't seriously be considering— I'm considering the results, Colonel. Your approach has produced constant conflict and civilian casualties. This woman's approach has produced cooperation and mutual protection, which serves American interests better. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that would reshape frontier policy for years to come. Eleanor realized she was witnessing a pivotal moment where individual courage and compassion were being validated at the highest levels of military authority. But the moment's significance extended beyond personal vindication. Morrison was essentially endorsing the concept that peace could be built through human connection rather than military domination, challenging fundamental assumptions about frontier relations that had dominated policy for decades. Thornfield made one final attempt to salvage his position. General, with all due respect, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow civilians to negotiate independently with hostile tribes, we undermine military authority and invite chaos. Morrison's eyes hardened as he turned to face his subordinate. Colonel, what I see here isn't chaos. What I see is the beginning of something that might actually work. And frankly, given the complete failure of your aggressive policies to produce anything but escalating violence, I'm inclined to try a different approach. The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, designed to end Thornfield's objections, without creating a public spectacle. Eleanor watched the Colonel's face cycle through anger, humiliation, and finally resigned acceptance as he realized his career had just taken a potentially fatal blow. But General Morrison wasn't finished reshaping the situation. He turned to address the assembled civilians with the authority of someone accustomed to making momentous decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, what's happened here represents an opportunity that may not come again. Mrs. Whitmore's actions have created a bridge between communities that have been at war for generations. The question is whether we're wise enough to recognize that opportunity and build upon it. Henrik Peterson stepped forward, his weathered face reflecting the hope that was beginning to stir among the settlers. What exactly are you proposing? General, I'm proposing that we formalize what Mrs. Whitmore has begun informally. A protected zone where both peoples can interact peacefully, trade safely, and resolve disputes through negotiation rather than violence. The concept was so radical that it took several moments for its full implications to sink in. Eleanor realized that Morrison was suggesting something unprecedented in frontier history, an official recognition that cooperation between white settlers and native tribes was not only possible, but preferable to endless warfare. Mrs. Morrison voiced the concern that was probably troubling many of the civilians. "General, how can we trust that the Indians won't use peace talks as an opportunity to scout our defenses for future attacks?" Standing Bear answered before Morrison could respond, his voice carrying the patient dignity of someone explaining obvious truth to those who'd been blinded by fear. "Mrs. Morrison, if my people wanted to attack your valley, we would not need to scout defenses. We have hunted this land for many generations. We know every trail, every water source, every place where horses can be hidden, and every ridge that offers clear shots at your homes." The blunt assessment sent a ripple of unease through the civilian group, but Standing Bear continued with words that transformed fear into understanding. "The reason your homes stand unburned, your families live unharmed, is not because you are too strong to attack. It is because most of my people prefer to live in peace if peace is offered with respect rather than contempt." Morrison nodded approvingly at the Lakota leader's directness. "Mr. Standing Bear raises an important point. Military strength alone cannot guarantee security when outnumbered by people who know the terrain better than we do. But mutual benefit and shared interests can create security that no amount of force can match." Eleanor watched faces around the group as this new perspective sank in. These were practical people who understood survival on harsh frontier, and the logic of cooperation was beginning to overcome ideological resistance. Thomas Patterson, a younger settler who'd remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "General, I've got a question. My wife's expecting our first child next month. If something goes wrong during the birth, the nearest doctor is 3 days' ride away. Are you saying we might be able to get help from Indian medicine people?" The question struck at the heart of frontier reality. Medical emergencies, dangerous wildlife, severe weather, all the challenges that made survival precarious for isolated homesteaders. Eleanor realized that Patterson was beginning to see potential benefits rather than just theoretical risks. Standing Bear's response reinforced this practical perspective. "My sister is a skilled healer. She has delivered many babies, saved many mothers when birth is difficult. Sacred debt includes sharing healing knowledge with those who need it." "And in return?" Morrison asked, clearly interested in the reciprocal aspects of such arrangements. "Trade goods, winter supplies, protection during dangerous seasons when game is scarce. Both peoples have skills, the other needs. Both peoples face the same threats from weather, predators, sickness." Eleanor felt excitement building as she realized they were moving beyond abstract discussion toward practical cooperation that could benefit everyone involved. The mountain lion attack had demonstrated how external threats created common interests that transcended cultural boundaries. But Thornfield made one more attempt to derail what he saw as dangerous naivety. "General, this all sounds very idealistic, but what happens when other Lakota bands refuse to honor these peaceful arrangements? What happens when warriors from outside this valley decide to test our defenses?" Morrison had clearly anticipated this objection. "That's exactly why we need local Lakota leaders like Mr. Standing Bear as partners rather than enemies. They have influence with other bands that we lack. They understand tribal politics in ways that our intelligence services obviously don't." He gestured toward Standing Bear with obvious respect. "Mr. Standing Bear, how would other Lakota leaders respond to a formal peace arrangement in this valley?" Standing Bear considered the question carefully before responding. Some will see wisdom in cooperation, especially younger chiefs who understand that endless war benefits no one. Others will resist, believing that any accommodation with whites is betrayal of ancestors. And your influence with the resistant factions, limited but real. I am a respected war chief with many victories against white soldiers. If I say peace is possible with honor, some will listen. If I say sacred debt requires protection of this valley, most will respect that obligation. Morrison absorbed this assessment with the clinical evaluation of a professional soldier calculating odds and alternatives. Eleanor could see him weighing the potential benefits of Lakota protection against the risks of depending on former enemies for security. "Mrs. Whitmore," Morrison said suddenly, "you've been remarkably quiet during this discussion. What's your assessment of the feasibility of such an arrangement?" Eleanor felt the weight of everyone's attention as she considered her response. Her answer could influence decisions that would affect lives for generations to come. General, 3 days ago, I thought I understood the boundaries between civilization and savagery. Then I met Lakota and his uncle and discovered that those boundaries exist more in our minds than in reality. If people can choose to see humanity in supposed enemies, then maybe peace isn't as impossible as we've been taught to believe. She paused, gathering courage to voice her deepest conviction. What I've learned is that hatred is a choice, but so is mercy. Fear is natural, but so is hope. We can continue choosing conflict because it's familiar, or we can risk choosing cooperation because it might actually work. Morrison studied her face as she spoke, reading the sincerity and hard-won wisdom in her expression. "And you'd be willing to serve as liaison between communities, helping to build the trust necessary for such cooperation?" The question took Eleanor by surprise, but as she considered it, she realized that her unique position as someone trusted by both sides gave her responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. "If I can help prevent more senseless killing, then yes, I'll do whatever is necessary." Standing Bear stepped forward to reinforce her commitment. "Medicine Woman speaks with wisdom's spirit. Both peoples trust her words because both peoples have seen her actions. She is a natural bridge between worlds that have been divided for too long." Lakota, who had been listening intently to the adult discussion, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that only children can bring to complex situations. "Uncle, remember the story grandmother told about the two rivers that fought each other until drought threatened to kill everything? They had to join together to survive, and when they did, they created something stronger than either river alone." Standing Bear's face lit up with pride at his nephew's wisdom. "Yes, nephew, separate rivers stay small, vulnerable to drought and flood. Joined river becomes powerful, capable of bringing life to vast territory." The metaphor resonated with everyone present, offering a way to understand cooperation that transcended political complications. Eleanor realized that Lakota's simple story had captured the essence of what they were attempting better than any adult explanation. Morrison seized on the boy's insight. "An apt metaphor, young man. And it suggests that what we're discussing isn't just about preventing conflict, but about creating something more beneficial than what either community could achieve alone." He turned to address the entire group with the authority of someone announcing policy decisions that would reshape frontier relations. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm prepared to recommend to territorial authorities that this valley be designated an official peace zone, with Mrs. Whitmore serving as civilian liaison and Mr. Standing Bear as tribal representative. Any attacks on either community would be considered violations of federal law, subject to military intervention." The announcement sent shockwaves through both groups. Eleanor realized that Morrison was essentially creating a new model for frontier relations, one based on partnership rather than domination, but practical questions remained. Mrs. Morrison voiced the concern that was probably troubling many civilians. "General, what about people who don't want to participate in this arrangement? What about those who prefer the old ways? No one will be forced to participate," Morrison assured her. "But those who choose continued hostility will find themselves isolated and without military support if their actions threaten the peace zone." Thornfield's face showed his shock at being essentially abandoned by his superior officer. "General, you're asking me to ignore standing orders about hostile Indians. I'm asking you to adapt standing orders to changing circumstances, Colonel. And if you find that impossible, I'm sure we can find other assignments that better suit your traditional approach to Indian relations." The threat was delivered with diplomatic courtesy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Thornfield could adapt to the new policy, or find himself transferred to some remote post where his aggressive instincts would cause less damage. Eleanor felt a surge of hope as she realized that Morrison was not just endorsing her actions, but building institutional support for the bridge she'd begun constructing between communities. The general's next words confirmed her growing optimism. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'll be recommending you for official recognition as a peacemaker whose actions prevented significant bloodshed and created opportunities for lasting stability. Your courage in sheltering an injured child has accomplished more for frontier security than months of conventional military operations." The validation meant more to Eleanor than any formal decoration could have. But even more meaningful was the recognition that mercy had indeed triumphed over military doctrine, that humanity had proven stronger than hatred. Standing Bear stepped forward to offer his own form of recognition. "Medicine Woman, you will always be welcome in Lakota camps. Your name will be spoken with honor in councils, told in stories to children who need to learn that courage comes in many forms." As the morning sun climbed higher over Devil's Ridge, Eleanor realized that the crisis that had threatened to destroy everything she'd tried to build had instead validated and strengthened it. The mountain lion's attack had forced enemies to become allies. Thornfield's hostility had prompted Morrison's intervention. Fear had been transformed into hope through the simple recognition that different peoples could choose to see humanity in each other. The crucible moment had tested everyone present, and most had chosen wisdom over prejudice, cooperation over conflict, mercy over military doctrine. The fragile bridge between worlds had not only survived, but had been reinforced with official support and institutional recognition. Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her. Soldiers and warriors, settlers and chiefs, all bound together by shared experience that had taught them peace was possible when people chose to make it possible. The boy she'd sheltered from a mountain lion had become the foundation for something much larger, proof that individual acts of courage could indeed change the course of history. 10 days after General Morrison's historic declaration, Eleanor stood on her porch, watching an impossible sight unfold across Devil's Ridge. Where once only wilderness had stretched between scattered homesteads, now smoke rose from multiple camps as Lakota families established temporary settlements alongside. White pioneers preparing for winter. The transformation seemed like something from a fever dream, yet the evidence surrounded her in undeniable reality. A delegation of 5 Lakota elders approached her cabin, led by an ancient woman whose weathered face spoke of wisdom earned through 8 decades of frontier survival. These were not the warriors who had come seeking Dakota, but spiritual leaders whose presence carried different significance entirely. Eleanor recognized the ceremony of formal recognition, something Standing Bear had explained would happen once. Tribal councils had deliberated on recent events. Eleanor Whitmore, the elderly woman, spoke in careful English, her voice carrying the authority of generations. I am Singing Crane, keeper of sacred stories for the Wind River people. We come to honor one who chose healing over hatred. The formal presentation took place in Eleanor's front yard, witnessed by settlers who had gathered from across the valley to see this unprecedented ceremony. Singing Crane produced a beautifully crafted medicine bag, its leather decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. This sacred pouch contains herbs blessed by our healers, stones touched by spirit power, and eagle feather blessed by sky spirits. It marks you as the adopted daughter of the Lakota nation, medicine woman whose name will be remembered when all of us have joined our ancestors. Eleanor accepted the gift with trembling hands, understanding that she was receiving an honor granted to perhaps a dozen white people in the entire history of Lakota interactions with settlers. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than the simple leather pouch itself. More than honor, Singing Crane continued, this creates obligation. You speak for Lakota people when misunderstandings arise. You speak for white people when our young warriors grow impatient with slow progress of peace. You become the voice of wisdom when fear tries to silence understanding. The ceremony concluded with the 5 elders taking positions around Eleanor's property, not as guards in the military sense, but as living symbols of tribal commitment to protecting what had been declared sacred ground. Their presence would communicate to any Lakota band, friendly or hostile, that this place enjoyed the highest form of tribal protection. Later that afternoon, Eleanor received another unexpected visitor. Dr. Samuel Matthews arrived from Fort Steele, carrying medical supplies and a proposal that would reshape her understanding of her role in the developing peace. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Matthews explained as they sat in her rebuilt kitchen, General Morrison has recommended establishing a medical station here in your valley, a place where both communities can bring their sick and wounded without fear of political complications. The concept intrigued Eleanor, though she recognized the challenges it would present. Doctor, I'm not formally trained. Everything I know comes from necessity and trial and error, which makes you perfect for frontier medicine, Matthews replied with a smile. Formal training means nothing when you're treating arrow wounds, snake bites, and mountain lion attacks. What matters is practical experience and the trust of your patients. He gestured toward the window where Dakota could be seen helping other Lakota youth construct winter shelters, alongside white children whose families had decided to remain in the peace zone through the harsh season ahead. That boy's healing is a testament to your skill, but more importantly, his willingness to work alongside white children is a testament to something more valuable than medical technique. You've created an environment where natural human cooperation can flourish. Eleanor watched the children working together, their laughter echoing across the valley as they competed to see who could construct the most elaborate shelters. Cultural differences seemed irrelevant when focused on shared tasks and common goals. The medical station would serve both communities, she asked, exclusively. White doctors treat white patients, Indian medicine men treat Indian patients, and mistrust grows in the gaps between. But you've already proven that healing transcends those artificial boundaries. Eleanor realized that Matthews was offering her a chance to formalize and expand what had begun with one wounded boy. The medical station would become another bridge between communities, a place where shared vulnerability in the face of illness and injury could continue building the trust that made peace possible. That evening, Standing Bear arrived with news that would test the fragile cooperation they'd worked so hard to build. His expression was grave as he shared intelligence from Lakota scouts operating in territories beyond the peace zone. 3 bands of young warriors approach from the north, he reported. They come seeking confrontation, believing that our cooperation dishonors warrior traditions and invites white expansion into all Lakota lands. Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach as she realized their experiment in peace was about to face its first serious challenge. How many warriors? Perhaps 40, led by War Eagle, my cousin's son. He is a skilled fighter, but believes only in solutions that come from warfare. He sees peace as weakness, cooperation as betrayal. The threat was serious enough that Standing Bear had immediately brought it to Eleanor's attention, recognizing that advance warning might allow them to prepare responses that didn't involve violence. But the approaching warriors represented exactly the kind of ideological opposition that could shatter everything they'd accomplished. What do they want, specifically? Eleanor asked. They demand that I renounce sacred debt, abandon protection of white settlements, and return to traditional warfare against land takers. If I refuse, they will challenge my authority through combat or raid the valley to prove that cooperation brings only vulnerability. Eleanor understood the devastating implications. If War Eagle's warriors attacked the peace zone, it would vindicate every argument made by people like Colonel Thornfield about the impossibility of trusting Indian promises. The fragile trust between communities would be destroyed in a single, violent episode, but Standing Bear's next words offered hope mixed with enormous risk. There is one possibility that might avoid bloodshed. War Eagle respects courage above all else. If Medicine Woman would speak to him directly, explain how sacred debt was earned, he might listen to wisdom rather than anger. You want me to negotiate with 40 hostile warriors? Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I want you to do what you have always done. See humanity where others see only enemies. War Eagle is angry, not evil. He fears that cooperation will lead to the destruction of Lakota culture. If you can help him understand that cooperation might actually preserve what matters most about our traditions, he might choose a different path. Eleanor realized that once again she was being asked to risk everything, on the possibility that mercy could triumph over hatred, that understanding could overcome fear. The stakes were higher now, involving not just her own life but the future of an entire experiment in peaceful coexistence. When will they arrive? Tomorrow at dawn. They will come in full war regalia, painted for battle, hoping to intimidate. Through display of force. If they meet only with force in response, fighting becomes inevitable. Eleanor spent that night in preparation that went beyond the practical matters of loaded weapons and defensive positions. She reviewed everything she'd learned about Lakota culture, customs, and values, seeking ways to frame her message that would resonate with warriors raised to see honor in combat. Dawn brought the thunder of hoofbeats as War Eagle's band crested the ridge overlooking Eleanor's valley. The sight was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. 40 mounted warriors in full regalia, their horses painted with war symbols, their own faces marked with designs that spoke of spiritual preparation for battle. But Eleanor had made her a choice. Instead of meeting them from defensive positions, she walked out alone into the open ground between the hostile warriors and the peace zone they threatened. In her hands, she carried only the medicine bag given by Singing Crane and a white cloth as symbol of her desire for peaceful communication. War Eagle rode forward to meet her, his young face hard with the certainty of righteous anger. When he spoke, his English was precise but cold. White woman who steals the loyalty of Lakota chiefs. I am War Eagle, son of Thunderhorse, keeper of warrior traditions that you seek to destroy. You will release my uncle from sacred debt and abandon this land, or face consequences that white soldiers cannot prevent. Eleanor met his gaze directly, recognizing in his fierce eyes the same protective instinct that had driven Standing Bear to search for his nephew. War Eagle wasn't evil, just terrified that everything his people valued was disappearing. War Eagle, I am Eleanor Whitmore, and I seek no one's destruction. Your uncle earned sacred debt by protecting me after I protected his nephew from mountain. Lion attack. I honored Lakota customs, and Lakota customs created obligations that transcend politics. Lakota customs do not include friendship with land takers who drive buffalo away and bring disease to our children. You're right, Eleanor agreed, surprising him with her directness. But they do include protecting those who show courage in helping family members. They do include honoring debts created through sacred law. Are you saying those traditions should be abandoned when they become inconvenient? War Eagle's certainty flickered as Eleanor turned his own arguments against him. She pressed her advantage carefully. I've lived among your people for 10 days, learning your ways, sharing your food, treating your sick. What I've seen isn't weakness, but strength, the ability to choose peace when peace serves your people better than war. That's not betrayal of warrior traditions, that's the highest form of warrior wisdom. The young war chief was clearly struggling with concepts that challenged everything he'd been taught about white people and their motivations. Eleanor realized that his anger came from genuine love for his people, making him potentially reachable through appeals to those same protective instincts. Your uncle didn't abandon warrior traditions when he chose cooperation. He demonstrated that true warriors protect their people through whatever means prove most effective. Sometimes that means fighting. Sometimes it means building alliances with former enemies who prove themselves worthy of trust. War Eagle's horse shifted restlessly beneath him as he processed her words. Finally, he spoke with less certainty than before. And if we choose your path of cooperation, what happens when more white settlers come demanding more land? What happens when your government decides that peace is less useful than conquest? The question went to the heart of legitimate Lakota, concerns about white expansion and treaty violations. Eleanor realized that her answer would determine whether War Eagle chose trust or continued hostility. I can't promise that all white people will honor agreements, just as you can't promise that all Lakota warriors will choose peace over raids. But I can promise that some of us will keep fighting for justice even when our own people choose injustice. Your uncle has seen that promise kept. Perhaps that's enough to risk believing it might be kept again. Her honest acknowledgement of white failures seemed to reach War Eagle in ways that false promises could never have achieved. Eleanor watched understanding dawn in his eyes as he recognized that she wasn't trying to deceive him, but to offer realistic hope based on demonstrated commitment. After a long silence, War Eagle dismounted and walked toward Eleanor with the fluid grace that marked him as a natural warrior. When he reached her, he extended his hand in the gesture of respect that standing Bear had taught her. Medicine woman speaks with straight tongue, he said formally. War Eagle will watch this peace with care. If white promises prove true, Lakota will honor them. If they prove false, then we return to old ways with a clear conscience. Eleanor grasped his hand, feeling the strength and calluses that spoke of a life dedicated to protecting his people. That's all anyone can ask for, War Eagle, the chance to prove that hope is stronger than fear. As the crisis dissolved into cautious acceptance, Eleanor realized that the peace they'd built was stronger than she dared imagine. It had survived, not just external challenges, but internal opposition from those who had every reason to distrust white promises. The valley that had once echoed with the sounds of conflict now hummed with the activities of two peoples learning to see each other as partners rather than enemies. Children played together while adults worked side by side, building not just structures for winter survival, but foundations for a future that transcended the limitations both cultures had accepted as permanent. Standing at her cabin door 10 days after the mountain lion attack, Eleanor understood that her simple choice to shelter an injured boy had indeed changed the course of history. The boy she'd saved had become the bridge between worlds, proving that individual acts of courage could create ripples of transformation that reached far beyond their origins. The legacy would continue growing long after those who'd planted its seeds had passed into legend, testament to the truth that mercy, once chosen, has power to reshape even the most impossible circumstances into expressions of hope. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.